First of all, in principle, there is no particular advantage in having a united foreign policy unless it results in a better foreign policy. You know, there's nothing especially good about being in a bigger state. I mean, you know, Norway is outside the European Union. Nobody would argue that Norway lacks influence in the world. Norway negotiated the Israel-Palestine Accords in Oslo. Norway negotiated the peace accords in Sri Lanka. Norway is active in the Sudan, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia. I remember the Norwegian ambassador to London, when they were applying to join the EU, said that the worst time for him was just before the no vote in the Norwegian referendum, because he said, I was always having to just sit there with the other 15, as it then was, the other 15 EU foreign ministers. Usually I didn't even get to speak. And then as soon as Norway voted no, they had to start dealing with me separately again. So at the risk of stating the obvious, a country is more influential if it has a foreign policy. Now, if there was an absolute identity of interests, then it might make sense for them to do things together. But look at what's actually happening in this EU foreign policy. People talk about, well, you know, the EU has all this sort of moral authority from doing the right things through persuasion instead of through force and all this kind of stuff. In the real world, what is this EU foreign policy? The EU foreign policy is to sell arms to China, something they've declared they want to do even though they haven't yet sold any. The EU policy is to refuse to have any dealings with the anti-Castro dissidents in Cuba. The EU foreign policy is to basically to recognise Hamas in all but name and to funnel. They're easily the biggest funders of the administration in the Gaza Strip. You know, the EU policy is to isolate Taiwan. Under all this rhetoric about ethical foreign policy, are you confident that we're getting a better result than we would have if the member countries pursued traditional diplomacy? But it's not necessarily desirable, even if it could be achieved. You know, a foreign policy that was then based on this entente with Russia, I put it to you, would be worse than separate foreign policies pursued on the basis of countries having to answer to their own electorates. I mean, the United Kingdom, of course, we want good relations with Russia, but the current Russian administration is not a good neighbour for us. You know, our ambassador in Moscow was harassed. His meetings were being attacked by, or not attacked by, but intimidated by the Putin Party youth organisation. There was this ridiculous thing where they pretended we were spying. Much more serious than that, a man living in the United Kingdom, resident in the UK, living under the Queen's peace, was murdered by. We can't say that he was murdered by agents of the Russian state, but we can say certainly that the Russian state has been remarkably uncooperative in finding out what's happened. Now, am I then happy to have our foreign policy with Russia, where there are a lot of issues that we need to resolve, contracted out to people who are influenced by whether Schroeder gets his position on the Gazprom board? How does that make us better off? Apart from anything else, you have an energy security issue with Russia. We don't. We're self-sufficient in energy. It's ridiculous that we're being dragged into this thing. Particular issues. The reason that we have these problems with Russia is because, without ever intending to or planning to, we have become the capital of the opposition. Because all of the people who have been exiled one way or another from this regime have ended up coming to London. And as a result of that, we now have a quite anti-British government in Moscow. I have friends who live there who say that they're amazed how often they see these kind of 1920s and 30s propaganda films where the British Secret Service with baddies. And it's simply because we have pursued a policy consistently of giving refuge to people who are fleeing political persecution. The EU's common policy is much more based around appeasement of Putin than our foreign policy would be as an independent country.
Yes, that's for sure.